Sunday morning, April 3rd, 1831, São Paulo province, Brazil. Inside the whitewashed walls of Nossa Senhora das Dores Chapel, 12 enslaved children dressed in starched cotton robes lift silver chalices toward the lips of their masters. The communion wine gleams dark as blood in the early light, filtering through stained glass. 37 plantation owners, their wives and overseers, tilt their heads back in prayer, unaware that salvation will not find them today. Within minutes, convulsions begin, screaming, vomiting, bodies collapsing across mahogany pews as the children stand motionless, watching with eyes that have seen too much, hands clasped in prayer position, voices still humming the final hymn. How does a group of children, none older than 14, coordinate an act of mass murder so precise, so coldly executed, that it would take investigators 3 months to uncover the truth? This wasn't a spontaneous act of violence. This was a conspiracy born from liturgical routine and nurtured in whispered Portuguese during choir practice, a rebellion disguised as devotion. What you're about to hear isn't just about poisoned wine. It's about how suffering can calcify into something far more dangerous than rage: patience. Before we continue, subscribe and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from and what time it is there. And if you want access to exclusive, uncensored videos about the world's most brutal crimes, consider becoming a member. Don't forget to hit the like button. Father Tomás Vieira de Almeida stood as the moral architect of this particular corner of hell, a Portuguese Jesuit whose sermons about obedience and suffering held a hypnotic power over both enslaved and enslaver. Approaching 60, with silver hair and hands that trembled slightly from what he claimed was devotion, but what others whispered might be syphilis, he had spent 30 years in Brazil perfecting the theology of subjugation. He genuinely believed, or performed belief convincingly, that slavery represented God's will, that African and indigenous souls required European masters to guide them toward civilization and salvation. His closest collaborator was Colonel Rodrigo Mendes Tavares, owner of the largest fazenda, and a man whose wealth derived equally from coffee exports and from breeding enslaved children to sell to other plantations. Tavares wore tailored suits from Lisbon, quoted Virgil in Latin, and collected classical sculpture, constructing an identity as a cultured gentleman while operating what amounted to a human livestock operation. Together, these men had created a system where religious instruction became another mechanism of control, where enslaved children were taught to sing hymns, praising their own bondage, where communion represented not unity with Christ, but acceptance of their God-ordained inferiority. Now, you have to understand, these weren't cartoon villains. They attended theater in São Paulo, donated to orphanages, wept during particularly moving liturgies. Their capacity for compartmentalization was the true horror. The children's choir of Nossa Senhora das Dores had earned a reputation across the province as evidence of the plantation system's enlightened character. Father Almeida promoted it as proof that enslavement could coexist with Christian education, that these young souls were being rescued from paganism through music and devotion. Twice weekly, 12 children between ages 7 and 14 gathered in the chapel's rear chamber for instruction in Latin hymns, Portuguese prayers, and the elaborate rituals of Catholic Mass. Visitors from São Paulo City would occasionally attend Sunday services specifically to hear these angelic voices, often commenting afterward on how well-behaved and content the children appeared, how their presence disproved abolitionist claims about slavery's cruelty. The choir program served multiple purposes. It provided free labor for religious ceremonies, created a public relations spectacle that enhanced the plantation's prestige, and most cynically identified which children possessed enough intelligence and discipline to potentially become house slaves rather than field laborers. Parents saw it as their children's best chance for survival. House slaves faced marginally less brutal conditions, slightly better food, and escape from the killing labor of coffee harvesting. Father Almeida framed his instruction as charitable work, often entertaining dinner guests with anecdotes about teaching Latin declensions to children who had arrived unable to speak proper Portuguese. The entire system functioned as theater, a performance of benevolent paternalism that convinced the performers of their own righteousness. What made the children's choir so effective as cover was how thoroughly it had been woven into the plantation's operational structure. The chapel sat at the physical center of the 7 fazenda complex, equidistant from each property, serving as both religious site and administrative hub where owners met to coordinate labor distribution, discuss market prices, and arrange sales of human beings between estates. Every Sunday, enslaved people from all 7 plantations were required to attend Mass, creating a weekly gathering of hundreds under the guise of worship, but functionally serving as a census and health inspection. Owners could observe which slaves showed signs of illness, pregnancy, or potential resistance. The children's choir occupied a unique position within this system. They arrived hours before services for practice, had access to the sacristy where wine and communion wafers were stored, and moved through spaces typically restricted to clergy and owners. Father Almeida had designed an elaborate rotation, ensuring that at least 4 choir members served as altar assistants during each Mass, responsible for preparing communion vessels, lighting candles, and handling the religious implements that literally put the tools of worship in their small hands. This wasn't carelessness, it was calculated. The priest believed that giving enslaved children responsibility for sacred objects would deepen their psychological submission, making them complicit in their own spiritual colonization. The chapel also contained Father Almeida's private quarters, a library, and a locked cabinet where he stored not only sacramental wine, but also the medical supplies, including various tinctures and compounds that he administered to enslaved people under the pretense of charitable health care. Several adults had noticed troubling changes in the children's behavior during the months preceding the massacre, but each observation was dismissed through the lens of racial assumptions that pervaded colonial Brazilian society. When 10-year-old Isabel began asking detailed questions about which plants in the garden were toxic versus medicinal, the groundskeeper mentioned it to Father Almeida, who praised her curiosity as evidence that religious instruction was awakening her intellect. When the children started arriving even earlier than required for choir practice, sometimes 2 hours before dawn, the sacristan interpreted this as growing devotion, perhaps even the stirrings of genuine faith rather than performed obedience. The fact that they had begun singing with particular intensity during the Agnus Dei, Lamb of God, who takes away the sins of the world, struck some listeners as almost unsettling in its fervor, but this too was reframed as spiritual breakthrough. Most tellingly, several children had been caught whispering in the chapel after practice had officially ended, falling silent immediately when adults approached. Rather than seeing conspiracy, Father Almeida saw shame. He assumed they were discussing topics they feared were sinful, perhaps questions about their bodies or doubts about doctrine. His response was to deliver a sermon about how God welcomed all questions, how nothing should be hidden from one's spiritual father, completely missing that their secrecy had nothing to do with shame and everything to do with survival. Let's be real. The adults saw what they expected to see: childlike simplicity, intellectual limitation, emotional transparency. They literally could not imagine that these children possessed the capacity for complex planning, for deception, for cold-blooded coordination. Maria Benedita occupied a position of impossible contradiction, a 38-year-old enslaved woman who served as both the children's primary caretaker and Father Almeida's housekeeper, moving between the senzala and the priest's quarters, trusted by neither world, but essential to both. She had been born on Tavares's fazenda, had survived the death of 4 of her own children before age 5, and had learned the particular skill of making herself seem simple and accommodating while observing everything. Father Almeida considered her loyal, perhaps even grateful for her position, which spared her from field labor and gave her marginally more authority than other enslaved women. The children knew her as someone who could sometimes sneak extra food, who would warn them when the overseer was in a particularly violent mood, who taught them which herbs could soothe whip wounds and which could do much more. Maria Benedita never directly participated in the children's planning. She was too pragmatic to believe a conspiracy could succeed, too worn down by decades of survival to risk what little security she had. But she also never stopped them, never reported their whispered conversations, never questioned why Isabel kept asking about the plants, never wondered aloud why the children seemed so interested in where Father Almeida stored his medical supplies. Her complicity was silence, a deliberate turning away at crucial moments, an act of non-intervention that might have been the most she could offer without destroying herself. Some would later call her a monster for not preventing what came. Others would recognize her as someone navigating an impossible moral landscape, someone who had long ago made peace with the fact that in her world, children were always dying anyway. I want you to picture this. Not the 37 who died, not yet. First, picture the 12 children who killed them. They ranged from 7-year-old João, so small he had to stand on a wooden box to reach the altar, to 14-year-old Catarina, whose body was already showing the changes that made enslaved girls vulnerable to a different kind of violence from their masters. Some had been born on the plantations. Others had been purchased as young children after their families were broken apart through sales. What united them was music. They had voices that Father Almeida considered worth training, which meant they possessed a quality that temporarily made them valuable beyond their labor capacity. But that value came with its own horror. Several of the girls had already survived sexual assaults from overseers or visiting plantation guests. The boys bore scars from whippings that started as young as age 5 for infractions like working too slowly or making eye contact with white children. They had watched siblings die from dysentery, malnutrition, and untreated infections. They had attended masses where Father Almeida preached that their suffering was divinely ordained, that obedience in this life guaranteed reward in the next, that resistance was not merely illegal, but sinful. These children lived in a state of constant pedagogical abuse. They were being educated specifically to internalize their own dehumanization, to sing praises to the system destroying them. Their choir robes were cleaned and pressed, their faces scrubbed before services, their voices trained to beauty, all while their bodies were starved, beaten, and used. The cognitive dissonance alone should have shattered them. Instead, it radicalized them. Father Bernardo Costa was everything Father Almeida was not. A young priest from Rio de Janeiro, barely 26, sent to the São Paulo interior for what his superiors called field experience, but what he increasingly suspected was punishment for asking too many questions about the church's relationship with slavery. He arrived at Nossa Senhora das Dores 3 weeks before the massacre, assigned to assist with the expanding congregation and supposedly to learn from Almeida's decades of pastoral experience. What he actually learned was horror. On the night of March 28th, unable to sleep in the humid darkness, Father Costa left his quarters for evening prayers in the chapel, approaching quietly so as not to disturb anyone who might already be inside. Through the sacristy door, left slightly ajar, he heard children's voices, not singing, but speaking in urgent, layered whispers, the sound of a conversation happening in careful stages, with long pauses between utterances. He couldn't make out specific words, but he heard his colleague's name spoken with a tone he couldn't quite identify. Not fear, exactly. Something colder. When he pushed the door open, he found the choir assembled around the cabinet where the sacramental wine was stored, Isabel holding a key that she should not have possessed. The children froze, their faces transforming in an instant from intense focus to performed innocence, and in that transformation, Father Costa saw something that terrified him more than their presence in a restricted space. He saw calculation, sophistication, adult-level deception. They were too good at lying, too practiced at becoming whatever adults expected to see. Father Costa spent that entire night wrestling with what he had witnessed, or rather, what he thought he might have witnessed, because the children's explanation had been so perfectly reasonable. Isabel claimed Father Almeida had given her the key to retrieve wine for an upcoming feast day, that they were practicing the timing of communion preparation to surprise him with their efficiency. It was exactly the kind of initiative that Almeida praised, exactly the sort of detail-oriented devotion he was supposedly cultivating. But something in their eyes, that flash before the innocent performance began, haunted Costa. The next morning, he approached Almeida carefully, mentioning that he'd found the children in the sacristy after hours, watching his colleague's face for any sign of concern. Instead, Almeida laughed warmly, clapping him on the shoulder with paternal condescension. "You're not accustomed to our ways yet, Bernardo. These aren't Rio's street children. These are my pupils, my spiritual sons and daughters. They have access because they've earned trust through obedience." The implicit message was clear. Costa's suspicion revealed his own inexperience, perhaps his own prejudice in not recognizing that enslaved children could be trustworthy. That night, Costa wrote a letter to his superior in Rio, carefully wording his concerns, but reading it back, he heard how paranoid it sounded. Children arranging communion vessels had made him fear some unnamed threat. He sealed it, but never sent it. The doubt consumed him. He began watching the children during practice, looking for signs of whatever he had sensed, but they were flawless, angelic, their voices raised in perfect harmony. He started wondering if plantation life was driving him toward suspicions that said more about his own instability than about any real danger. This is where the story gets truly chilling, because Father Costa was right and his self-doubt nearly enabled a massacre. After discovering the children in the sacristy, Father Costa did take one concrete action. He mentioned his concern to Colonel Tavares during a formal dinner at the main house, framing it carefully as a question about security protocols rather than an accusation. Tavares listened with the patient attention of someone humoring an anxious subordinate, then explained the plantation's careful system of surveillance and control. Every enslaved person's location was accounted for through a series of checkpoints and required permissions. The children's access to the chapel was logged and supervised. Father Almeida had developed his educational methods over 3 decades without incident. More importantly, Tavares emphasized the psychological impossibility of what Costa seemed to fear. Enslaved children lacked the intellectual capacity for complex conspiracy, their cognitive development arrested by inferior breeding and lack of exposure to civilization. This wasn't mere prejudice. This was established scientific consensus among Brazilian intellectuals of the era, published in medical journals, taught at universities. Tavares even pulled a leather-bound volume from his library, reading passages from a São Paulo physician's treatise on racial mental capacity, showing Costa the scholarly apparatus that made his fears seem not merely unfounded, but scientifically impossible. The colonel arranged for a formal inspection of the chapel's secure areas, conducted by the plantation's overseer, who found everything in order. Wine stores accounted for, no signs of tampering, all locks functional. A report was written and filed, creating a paper trail that would later demonstrate that concerns had been raised and properly investigated. The system had examined itself and found no problems, as systems always do. Something had shifted in the children after Father Costa found them in the sacristy, a change so subtle that only someone watching for it could notice. Caterina, the oldest, had always been quiet, but now her silence had a quality of watchfulness that suggested she was measuring distances, calculating angles, observing patterns in adult behavior. During choir practice, the children began incorporating a new element into their routine. They would ask Father Almeida to demonstrate the precise movements of communion service, claiming they wanted to perform their duties with perfect reverence. The priest, delighted by this apparent spiritual growth, would slowly walk them through each step: how to hold the chalice, how to tilt it toward the communicant's lips, how to ensure each person received the sacrament. The children watched with an intensity that might have seemed like devotion, but was actually something closer to tactical training. Young João, previously timid to the point of trembling when called upon, began volunteering to be the first to practice these movements, developing a steady-handed confidence that impressed the adults. What no one recognized was that trauma had calcified into purpose. These children had moved beyond fear into a space of absolute conviction, where the normal survival instinct to avoid danger had been replaced by something more dangerous: the certainty that they had nothing left to lose. Several had recently witnessed particularly brutal punishments. A boy from another fazenda publicly whipped until bones showed, a young woman sold away from her infant child. That seemed to have broken something in their ability to hope that accommodation and obedience might someday be rewarded. They still sang, still smiled when required, still performed submission, but they were no longer present in those performances. They had already left their bodies, already accepted whatever consequences would come, already died in every way that mattered. Now you have to understand, what the children were planning required knowledge that enslaved people were not supposed to possess, botanical expertise that revealed an underground education system running parallel to Father Almeida's religious instruction. For generations, enslaved Africans and indigenous Brazilians had preserved medical knowledge about which plants could heal and which could kill, information passed through whispered conversation, demonstrated through shared meals, coded into songs and stories. On the fazendas surrounding Nossa Senhora das Dores, older enslaved women served as informal healers, treating everything from fever to difficult births with remedies made from local flora. Isabel, the girl found with the sacristy key, had been apprenticing with such a healer, an elderly woman named Josefa, who maintained a small garden behind the senzala. What Isabel learned there went beyond medicine. She learned about alkaloids and cardiac toxins, about substances that could be tasteless when properly prepared, about dosages that would act slowly or quickly depending on calculation. The children's conspiracy required synthesizing this knowledge with their access to the chapel. They identified manisoba, a plant whose leaves, if improperly prepared, released enough cyanide to be lethal, and created an extraction process using the ceramic bowls and heating implements from Josefa's healing practice. The methodology was sophisticated. They needed a toxin that would be tasteless in wine, would act slowly enough that the children could distribute communion to everyone before symptoms began, and would create symptoms dramatic enough to prevent medical intervention. They tested their preparation on a stray dog, observing the progression from consumption to death, then adjusted their calculations. This wasn't impulse or rage. This was patient, systematic planning that demonstrated cognitive abilities their masters insisted they didn't possess. There are no comfortable heroes in this story, but if pressed to name one, we'd have to discuss Dr. Helena Andrade de Souza, a woman whose very existence challenged every convention of 1830s Brazilian society. At 42, she was the only female physician legally practicing in São Paulo province, having earned her medical degree in Paris after Brazilian universities refused her admission. She had returned to São Paulo specifically to work with enslaved populations, motivated less by abolitionist politics than by scientific curiosity. The fazendas represented an opportunity to observe diseases and treatments on a scale impossible in Europe, a moral calculation that makes her deeply problematic as any kind of heroine. Dr. Andrade had a standing arrangement with several plantations to provide medical care beyond what overseers could offer, making her monthly rounds to treat serious injuries and infections, her services paid for by owners who saw her as an investment in their property's health. She was pragmatic to the point of coldness, known for amputating infected limbs without anesthesia, for treating enslaved people's bodies as medical puzzles rather than as suffering humans. Yet she also possessed an observational precision that others lacked. She noticed patterns, documented discrepancies, refused to accept surface explanations when clinical evidence suggested otherwise. 3 weeks before the massacre, Dr. Andrade had treated Catarina for a wound that the girl claimed came from falling during choir practice. The injury's location and angle were inconsistent with a fall, more suggestive of a deliberate cut, perhaps self-inflicted. When questioned, Catarina held her gaze with a directness that enslaved children were taught to avoid. And in that moment, Dr. Andrade saw something she had learned to recognize in her years treating traumatized populations: the look of someone who had already decided to die. Dr. Andrade's investigation began not from heroism, but from scientific irritation. Catarina's wound wasn't healing properly, showing signs of deliberate interference, as though the girl was preventing her own recovery. This suggested either psychological disturbance or intentional self-harm, both interesting enough to warrant closer observation. Under the pretense of monitoring the wound's progress, Dr. Andrade arranged to visit the fazenda weekly, spending time specifically with the choir children under the justification that she was conducting a health survey of juvenile populations for a paper she was preparing. Her actual methodology was interrogation disguised as examination. She asked each child to describe their daily routines, their meals, their activities, watching for inconsistencies in their stories. She inquired about their access to the chapel, to the gardens, to areas typically restricted. Most critically, she asked them to identify plants from botanical drawings, claiming she wanted to understand what indigenous medicinal knowledge they might have absorbed. Isabel recognized every toxic plant Dr. Andrade showed her, then quickly pretended she didn't. But the flash of recognition came first. The physician began documenting. Children who should have been illiterate could read Latin from the Missal. Children described as simple-minded could calculate compound measurements. Children dismissed as incapable of abstract thought were maintaining a conspiracy requiring operational security more sophisticated than most military campaigns. Dr. Andrade's clinical notes from this period, later recovered, show her conclusions taking shape. In her cold, analytical language, she wrote, "Subjects demonstrate advanced cognitive function deliberately concealed. Collective behavior suggests organized resistance activity. Recommend increased monitoring, potential preemptive intervention." She brought these concerns to Colonel Tavares on March 30th. He dismissed them as the paranoid observations of a woman whose education had made her overwrought. She had 3 days to prove him wrong. Can you handle what comes next? Because this is where the story turns truly chilling, where we move from preparation to execution, where children become mass murderers and the concept of justice becomes impossible to locate. I need you to understand something before we continue. You're about to hear details that will make you uncomfortable, that should make you uncomfortable, because any story where children commit calculated violence forces us to confront questions without satisfying answers. Who are the victims here? Who are the perpetrators? When does survival become revenge? When does revenge become justice? And when does justice become atrocity? These are not rhetorical questions with easy answers. What happened on April 3, 1831, inside Nossa Senhora das Dores Chapel, cannot be simplified into a comfortable narrative where the oppressed heroically strike back against oppressors. It was more complicated, more disturbing, more human than that. Before you exit this video, before you decide you've heard enough, I'm asking you to stay, to witness what these children did, to resist the urge to look away or to reduce them to either victims or villains. They were both and neither, and the only way to honor what happened is to look at it fully. If you're still here, if you can handle the next part of this investigation, do me a favor. Leave a comment right now telling me whether you think what happened next was justice or murder. Don't hedge. Force yourself to choose, because in 30 seconds, you're going to understand why that choice is impossible to make. Dr. Andrade did not wait for Colonel Tavares's permission. On the evening of April 2nd, using a medical emergency as pretext, claiming she needed to retrieve supplies from her previous visit, she entered the senzala after dark, something no white person typically did. She found Josefa, the elderly healer, tending a small fire behind the slave quarters, and in that firelight she saw ceramic bowls containing a dark residue, saw bundles of plants hanging to dry, saw the careful apparatus of botanical extraction. Josefa looked at her with neither fear nor defiance, just tired acknowledgement. And when Dr. Andrade asked what was being prepared, the old woman said simply, "Liberation." The word in Portuguese, libertação, carried religious weight, suggesting salvation, transcendence, freedom through any means necessary. Dr. Andrade pressed, "Liberation how? For whom? When?" But Josefa just smiled, and in that smile was centuries of knowledge about what white authorities could and could not stop. The physician left and went directly to the chapel, arriving near midnight, finding Father Costa still awake in his quarters. She laid out her concerns, the children's access, their botanical knowledge, the toxins being prepared, the timing around the upcoming Sunday service when all the plantation owners would be present. Father Costa, already haunted by his own suspicions, felt his paranoia validated and weaponized into action. Together they went to the sacristy, inspecting the wine storage, and found nothing immediately suspicious. The bottles were sealed, properly stored, untampered with, as far as they could tell. Dr. Andrade insisted something would happen during the preparation, immediately before service, during that brief window when the children had unsupervised access to the communion vessels. They developed a plan. They would monitor the children from a concealed position during the service. Early morning preparation, observe without interfering, catch them in the act with undeniable proof. It was a reasonable plan that completely misunderstood the children's timeline. The wine had been poisoned 3 days earlier, Sunday, April 3rd, 1831. The massacre began at 7:47 a.m. Dr. Andrade and Father Costa were positioned in the sacristy storage alcove, watching through a crack in the wooden paneling as the children performed their communion preparation with perfect, practiced reverence. Isabel poured wine from sealed bottles into silver chalices, while João arranged the communion wafers on golden patens. The children worked in coordinated silence, their movements ritual perfect, and nothing about their behavior suggested conspiracy. At 8 o'clock a.m., the plantation owners and their families began filing into the chapel, taking their assigned places in the front pews. Colonel Tavares and his wife, the other 6 fazenda owners, overseers, house slaves, serving as ushers. Father Almeida emerged in full vestments, and the mass began. Dr. Andrade, watching, felt her certainty waver. Perhaps she had been wrong. Perhaps her suspicions revealed more about her own cynicism than about any real danger. Then communion began. The children moved through the congregation with those silver chalices, and here is where their plan revealed its sophistication. They didn't serve the enslaved attendees in the back pews. The communion was distributed only to the white plantation owners and their families, a detail that looked like normal hierarchical protocol, but was actually ruthless selection. Each person tilted their head back, received the sacrament, and returned to their seat. The children sang the Agnus Dei with voices so pure they might have been angels. Father Almeida raised his hands in blessing, and then the screaming started. Not immediately. The toxin required 15 minutes to metabolize, but explosively. Multiple people simultaneously convulsing. Dr. Andrade burst from her hiding place, already assessing what she was witnessing. Mass poisoning, symptoms consistent with cyanide, too many patients for effective intervention. She shouted for water, for anything to induce vomiting, but the chapel descended into chaos. People stampeding toward exits, children scattering, the communion wine spreading in dark pools across stone floors. Dr. Andrade moved through the chaos with clinical precision, performing triage, identifying who might be saved. She forced water mixed with activated charcoal down the throats of those still conscious, used her fingers to induce vomiting, worked with the frantic desperation of someone trying to stop an avalanche with her hands. Father Costa held Colonel Tavares as the man convulsed, his wife already dead beside him, their combined wealth and power suddenly meaningless against botanical chemistry. Of the 37 who consumed the poisoned communion, 12 died within the hour. Another 14 would die over the next 3 days, despite Dr. Andrade's interventions. 11 survived, though several were permanently damaged, their neurological systems ravaged by the toxin. As the initial chaos subsided, as the reality of what had happened crystallized, attention turned to the children. They had not fled. That was perhaps the most disturbing element. The 12 choir members had retreated to the altar, where they stood in formation, hands clasped, still wearing their white robes now spattered with their victims' vomit and blood. When Father Costa demanded to know what they had done, it was Caterina who answered, not with confession or justification, but with a single word, communion. She said it in Latin, communio, with perfect pronunciation, with the same reverent tone Father Almeida had taught them, and in that moment Father Costa understood that they had transformed the sacrament into its opposite, had weaponized the very ritual meant to unite believer with Christ. The surviving plantation owners, once they could stand, wanted immediate execution. But Dr. Andrade intervened, insisting on investigation, on documentation, on understanding the methodology. Her scientific interest in how enslaved children had accomplished sophisticated poisoning briefly overcame the rage for vengeance, buying the children days rather than minutes. Those days would be their last. The official investigation began on April 5th, led by a magistrate from Sao Paulo City, accompanied by militia forces. They started with the Senzala, specifically with Josefa's quarters, finding her botanical laboratory immediately. The ceramic bowls Dr. Andrade had seen now sat in full view, containing plant matter in various stages of extraction. Josefa made no attempt to hide her involvement, explaining her process with the technical precision of someone describing a legitimate medical procedure. The selection of manisoba leaves, the careful boiling to concentrate toxins, the mixture with wine 3 days before the massacre to allow flavors to integrate. She had tested the dosage to ensure lethality, had calculated the timing to delay symptoms until all targets had consumed the sacrament. When asked why she had helped the children, she replied simply that they had asked, and she had said yes, because some requests cannot be refused when they come from children who have already been murdered in every way except physically. The investigation then moved to the chapel, where they discovered the real horror. A journal hidden beneath the altar cloth, written in Portuguese with occasional Latin phrases, detailing not just the practical planning of the massacre, but its theological justification. The children had kept a collective diary, different handwriting contributing entries, working out their reasoning in conversation with the very religious instruction Father Almeida had provided. They quoted scripture, "Let the little children come to me, for such is the kingdom of heaven," and asked why they were denied even that promise, why their suffering was called holy, while their master's comfort was called deserved. They described specific acts of violence they had witnessed or endured, creating a clinical record of brutality. Most disturbingly, they had calculated not just the massacre, but its aftermath. Understanding they would likely be executed, but deciding that the exchange rate, their 12 lives for dozens of their oppressors, was acceptable mathematics. As the investigation deepened, attention turned to Father Almeida, who had survived the poisoning only because he habitually took communion last after the consecrated wine had been exhausted. The priest insisted he had been deceived by children he had trusted, students he had nurtured, and this narrative initially satisfied authorities looking for simple explanations. But Dr. Andrade began examining the chapel's records, baptismal certificates, punishment logs, medical treatment documentation, and found patterns that revealed the systematic horror underlying the massacre. Father Almeida had personally baptized 87 children over his 3 decades at Nossa Senhora das Dores. Of those 87, 63 had died before age 12, mortality rates that shocked even a physician accustomed to the brutality of plantation life. The causes of death were documented in the priest's meticulous Latin: fever, injury, malnutrition, infection. But what the records also showed was his spiritual interpretation of these deaths as evidence of God's plan, his sermons describing each child's suffering as divinely ordained pedagogy. He had created a theological framework that transformed atrocity into virtue. Colonel Tavares, barely surviving the poisoning, his body ravaged, initially presented himself as a victim of unwarranted violence. But militia forces searching his fazenda found the breeding records, a ledger documenting enslaved women's reproductive histories, tracking which children showed desirable traits for sale, noting which bloodlines produced strong laborers or aesthetically pleasing house slaves. The document's clinical language revealed a man who had fully embraced the logic of human livestock management, who saw children not as moral subjects but as capital investments. The investigation uncovered letters between Tavares and other plantation owners discussing strategies to separate enslaved families before emotional bonds could form, describing this as sound business practice. These men weren't monsters. They were something worse. Ordinary people who had convinced themselves that extraordinary evil was reasonable, justified, even righteous. What began as an investigation into a single massacre soon revealed connections that stretched far beyond 7 plantations in São Paulo province. Dr. Andrade, continuing her methodical documentation, discovered correspondence between Father Almeida and Jesuit institutions across Brazil, Portugal, and even Louisiana in the United States. Letters discussing methodologies for spiritual education of inferior populations that revealed a transatlantic network of religious figures theorizing the theological justification for slavery. These weren't isolated monsters, they were part of an intellectual ecosystem that produced peer-reviewed papers, held conferences, and developed systematic approaches to maintaining subjugation through spiritual manipulation. The investigation expanded to the other fazendas in the Nossa Senhora das Dores network, uncovering similar children's choirs at 3 other plantations, all following Father Almeida's educational model, all placing enslaved children in positions of ritual responsibility meant to deepen their psychological submission. Interviews with those children revealed that they had known about the poisoning plan, had been invited to participate, but their circumstances differed enough that they had chosen not to join. This suggested the conspiracy wasn't unique, but rather represented one successful execution of a resistance strategy that existed as shared knowledge across enslaved communities. Most disturbingly, the botanical knowledge that Isabel had learned from Josefa traced back to a sophisticated underground education system where enslaved Africans and indigenous Brazilians had been preserving and teaching survival techniques, including methods of resistance, for generations. The children's choir massacre wasn't an isolated incident, but rather a visible manifestation of invisible networks. The public response to the Nossa Senhora das Dores massacre revealed how deeply Brazilian society was invested in maintaining comforting lies about slavery's nature. Initial newspaper reports from São Paulo framed the incident as evidence of African savagery, using the children's actions as proof that enslaved populations required even stricter control, that the colony's stability depended on preventing education that might enable future conspiracies. Abolitionist voices attempting to contextualize the massacre within slavery's broader violence were systematically silenced. 2 Rio de Janeiro journalists, who published articles questioning why children would resort to mass murder, found their presses destroyed by mobs. The Catholic Church moved swiftly to contain the scandal's theological implications, reassigning Father Almeida to a remote parish and destroying much of his correspondence, ensuring that questions about how religious instruction intersected with slavery's maintenance never received public examination. Dr. Andrade attempted to publish her clinical findings about the massacre's methodology, but São Paulo's medical journals rejected her papers, editors explaining that publicizing enslaved people's capacity for sophisticated conspiracy might inspire imitation. The surviving plantation owners formed a coordinated front, using their economic power to pressure officials toward executions rather than extended investigation, arguing that public trials would only provide platforms for abolitionist agitation. Most effectively, the conspiracy of silence operated through simple omission. By 1835, just 4 years after the massacre, most official records referred to it vaguely as the Communion Incident, stripping the event of specificity, making it easy to forget or deliberately misremember. The 12 children were executed on April 29, 1831, 26 days after the massacre, following a trial that lasted less than 3 hours. They were hanged publicly in São Paulo city center, their bodies displayed for 2 days as warning to other enslaved populations, then buried in unmarked graves. Catarina, the oldest, was 14. João, the youngest, was 7. Witnesses described the children singing hymns as they approached the gallows, specifically the Agnus Dei they had performed during communion service, their voices clear and steady. Some observers interpreted this as remorse, proof they understood the sinfulness of their actions. Others recognized it as defiance, a final performance that transformed execution into something uncomfortably close to martyrdom. Josefa was not executed. At 68, she was considered too old to pose future threat, but was sold to a distant plantation in Bahia, separated from the community she had served for decades, dying within a year under circumstances never officially documented. Father Almeida survived another 15 years, reassigned to rural Minas Gerais, continuing ministry until his death in 1846. His obituary praised his devotion and made no mention of Nossa Senhora das Dores. Colonel Tavares never fully recovered, suffering neurological damage that left him partially paralyzed, dying in 1834. Dr. Andrade faced professional consequences. São Paulo's medical society censured her for exceeding her authority, effectively ending her career. She returned to France in 1833, publishing a memoir Europeans dismissed as exaggerated. Father Costa left the priesthood within a year, unable to reconcile what he had witnessed with his faith. The Nossa Senhora das Dores massacre functioned as a ghost in Brazilian historical memory, present enough that it couldn't be entirely erased, but suppressed enough that its implications never received full reckoning. The incident contributed to escalating anxieties among Brazilian elites about slavery's sustainability, fears that eventually influenced Brazil's gradual abolition process that wouldn't conclude until 1888, 57 years after the children's execution. But the massacre was never integrated into abolitionist narratives because it couldn't be made comfortable. The children weren't passive victims awaiting rescue, but active agents who chose violence, who killed not in hot rage but through cold calculation, who demonstrated capacities that undermined paternalistic narratives about enslaved people needing white saviors. The moral question at the massacre's center remains unresolvable. Can violence committed by the utterly powerless against their oppressors be judged by the same ethical standards applied to violence by the powerful against the powerless? The children killed 37 people, many who had directly brutalized them, but also some who had merely benefited passively from slavery's structure. Were they freedom fighters or murderers, heroes or criminals? The answer is probably both, simultaneously, which makes their story so difficult to absorb. What the massacre definitively proves is that oppression always creates conditions for resistance, that surveillance and control can never fully eliminate human agency, that systematically dehumanized people don't lose their humanity, but rather have it compressed and intensified until it explodes in ways that horrify those who created the pressure. Could something like this happen today? Would we even see it coming? Sit with that question, because variations of this story continue playing out wherever power concentrates, and certain populations are systematically denied humanity. Subscribe if you want stories that refuse comfortable answers, that insist you wrestle with moral complexity rather than easy narratives about heroes and villains. Share this with someone who needs to understand that history's most disturbing moments are the ones we've worked hardest to forget.